Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the Inclusion Institute. In this session, we will discuss building executive functioning skills into instruction, and we will specifically spotlight strategies for supporting executive function skills at school and home. My name is Amy Accardo. I'm an associate professor in the Interdisciplinary and Inclusive Education Department at Rowan University, and I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Casey Woodfield.
Hi, everyone. My name is Casey Woodfield. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Interdisciplinary and Inclusive Education at Rowan University. So today we have two main goals for this session. The first one is to provide K-12 educators and parents with a basic understanding of executive functioning and how it impacts student success. And second, we're going to spotlight a few inclusive strategies to support students in strengthening executive functions in home and school environments. So we'll start off with a definition of what executive functioning is. We have here the definition that the executive functions are a set of processes that all have to do with managing oneself and one's resources in order to achieve a goal. It's an umbrella term for the neurologically based skills involving mental control and self-regulation. So in other words, executive functions are the processes we use to perform daily tasks, such as planning our day, organizing our rooms or our spaces, strategizing how to solve problems, or regulating our emotions when faced with things like disappointment. Executive functions are essentially the command center in the brain. So on the next slide, we have some specific examples of what falls under the umbrella of executive functioning. So things like impulse control, emotional regulation and control, flexible thinking, working memory, self-monitoring, planning and prioritizing, task initiation, and organization are all examples of executive functioning skills. Recent shifts, when we're thinking about the current context, the shifts during the pandemic to online learning, the unexpectedness of everything that's been going on during the pandemic, have all shifted the executive functioning demands that have been placed on our K-12 students, both at home and at school. So for example, students have been expected to be flexible on a daily basis through changing learning schedules from hybrid, online, and in person. They've been expected to maintain focus during long online learning sessions through Zoom or other platforms. And they've been expected to manage their emotions, spending extended periods of time with siblings, parents, and caregivers at home and in the community. So executive functioning differences impact students at school and at home because executive functions are what we use to regulate all of our behaviors and our actions. For students with executive functioning differences, this can impact how they learn and how they perform or act in schools and at home. Students with executive functioning differences might have difficulty managing their time and space. For example, during things like planning a long-term project, telling a story verbally or in writing, communicating details in organized or sequential manner, memorizing and retrieving information, generating activities or ideas, and retaining information. So for students with executive functioning differences, it's really important to think about how to support executive functioning through scaffolding and explicit instruction of those skills to help them be successful. It's not something that we can expect students to develop necessarily on their own, but explicit focus on how to support the development of those skills and how to support executive functions, especially for students with executive functioning differences, is really important.
And while all students benefit from explicit instruction in building executive function skills, students with disability labels such as ADHD, autism, and dyslexia may benefit even more from supportive instruction. And with the growing or increasing number of neurodivergent students in our classrooms comes a need for teachers to build a strength-based focus on executive functioning skills into daily instruction. So we want to focus on building on student strengths, and it's essential to take time with students to identify what each of their strengths and goals are related to key executive skills. We provide a few resources on this slide on the right side The top book, Neurodiversity in the Classroom, is recommended for establishing a strength-based focus in your classroom, and it's also an excellent resource for developing strength-based IEPs. And the book in the bottom right is recommended for home use and for supporting autistic young adults in working on executive skills and also study strategies. So continuing with identifying executive function strengths and goals, one way to do this is by building some kind of a chart or a graphic organizer with each student and considering 4 key questions. So let's use the executive functioning skill example of organization. You may ask the question, what are the students' strengths and weaknesses related to organization? What are the related learning goals? Do we have any that we're working on? What accommodations are important to provide for the student, and what strategies can the student begin to use with some scaffolded support? And for example, you may work with students to self-reflect and to come up with some ideas similar to what's in the box in the center of this slide. A student may work with you and identify that an organizational strength they have is keeping their papers well organized. They may identify as a weakness that it's hard to keep their thoughts organized. And then collaboratively, you could establish a learning goal. Okay, let's work on strategies to keep track of your thoughts so that you can get your work done. You can have the teacher provide an accommodation of outlines, graphic organizers, or lists of topics in writing to help the student keep organized. And then you can support the student in strategies such as writing down plans, recording their ideas so that they have a paper copy that helps them keep track of their work. So as Casey mentioned, over the past year, our students have been receiving varied level of supports because they've been in home environments as a result of the pandemic. And we know that some parents, caregivers are doing things like setting up home desk space with a whiteboard and helping their students make a daily list of what to accomplish, yet other students are receiving absolutely no support for executive skills. So we can anticipate that our students are going to return in the fall with a heightened need for support in executive function skills. And modeling and teaching executive functioning rather than expecting the child to develop them on their own is a really good strategy and is really the focus of this session today. So how do we teach executive function skills? For starters, we can model the use of our own executive skills by sort of self-narrating. So that could look like if you're home and you're planning a vacation, narrating for your student and your child, right? We are going to work on the executive skill of planning and prioritizing because we're going on a big trip. So our strategy is to make lists. And instead of just making the list yourself, give your child, Post-it notes and pens, have them make some lists for the trip as well, and then reinforce that helped them remember everything that they wanted to bring. And then similarly, in the classroom, you can build on academic skills by also explicitly talking about executive skills. So we'll talk a little bit about writing today, but during writing time, for example, you could spotlight that we're going to work on the executive skill of goal-directed behavior. Our goal is to write a topic sentence, and to support you all, I'm going to try the strategy of a timer. And then at the end of that academic task, in addition to reviewing how the writing went, be sure to come back and talk about and reflect upon how the strategy worked. So it gets feedback from the students. How did you feel about the timer? Did that strategy help you achieve the goal? Maybe is it a strategy that you could also implement or use at home? So with this goal in mind of explicitly teaching executive function skills, Casey and I have selected 6 specific skills that we note are applicable to both home and school environments. And they're shown around the graphic here on this slide. And on the next few slides, we'll provide a takeaway strategy or 2 for explicitly teaching each of these. So we're going to look at self-monitoring, planning and prioritizing, working memory, task initiation, regulating emotions, and goal-directed persistence. So the first executive skill we will spotlight is self-monitoring. And self-monitoring is the ability to evaluate yourself, including what's happening in your own body, how you're responding, how you're feeling, how you're behaving. And self-monitoring can be linked to learning. So for example, a sixth grader may be reading a paragraph in a science text, self-monitor and realize she didn't remember what she read. So she may use the strategy of starting over and reading that paragraph again. And that same student may be in a quiet library and realize she needs to self-monitor and lower her voice. Other people are looking her way if maybe she's talking with emotion or loudly. So a few strategies that we provide to work on self-monitoring are first self-monitoring checklists, and those can be paired with adult support for check-in or check-out. And self-monitoring checklists are something that we recommend doing class-wide. We recommend class-wide checklists because that really empowers all of your students as opposed to singling any one student out. And checklists paired with adult support make students know that they have a caring support system, that their self-monitoring matters, and that adults see that it matters. A second strategy is class self-monitoring cards, and by that we just mean some kind of a visual support, and we'll take a look at red, yellow, green cards on the next slide. So in terms of a self-monitoring checklist, you can see on the right side of this slide, a real basic example. This could be implemented as part of a morning routine where your students have on their desk a half sheet of paper, and they just quickly check off whether or not they were on time, prepared, have their homework. There are also a few additional questions you could add, things like, do you feel ready to learn? Have you had breakfast? And those provide some information for follow-up conversations. So for example, if you note that a student is repeatedly not feeling ready to learn, then you would have that individual conversation with them. I can tell that through your daily self-monitoring checklist, you haven't felt ready. Let's work on some new strategies to implement so we can make sure you feel ready each day. And then in terms of those self-monitoring check-in cards, we have the green, yellow, and red cards here. These really work well with students of all levels. Using that writing example again, we could say to students, we're working on the goal of writing a topic sentence. I have the timer going. While you're working, put your red card out on your desk if you are completely stuck and you need me to come over before you can move forward. Yellow if you'd like me to come over, but you're okay. And green if you've got this. So again, showing students that their self-monitoring is valued.
So moving on to the executive skill of planning and prioritizing. This is the ability to determine what is and what is not important in any given time. So an example is a child really wants to prioritize making a birthday card for his mom when she gets home from work. And so having a plan to get that done within the given time frame between school and when she gets home. So here we have two examples of strategies. The first is thinking about schedules. So we know that schedules being posted at school or maybe at home is a really common and helpful inclusive practice. But we want to remind everybody that having a visual, either or both, up at the front of the room and available for students at their desks is a really great practice. We also want to get into the habit of providing auditory reminders on how to reference them. So just giving students access to a schedule is often not enough. They really need to be supportive in how and why to integrate using the schedule throughout their day. So this kind of support can orient students to their time and through transitions. And a great way to also integrate self-monitoring into using a schedule is to build in those kinds of pauses and prompts that help students reflect on their use of time. So for example, look at where you are. We're going to transition in 5 minutes. What might you do differently next time? So that's really helping with planning and prioritizing and incorporating self-monitoring as well. The second example we have are prioritized to-do lists. So we know how helpful it can be to create lists of tasks of things to do. It's very satisfying to check things off, right? And that's something that we can support students in doing, but really scaffolding the process of prioritizing through developing a to-do list can be a really helpful strategy. So we have an example on the next slide, which I'll walk you through, but really this is just the practice of developing the to-do list and then choosing what top 3, for example, priorities are most important, preferential, or time sensitive for that student at a given time. So here we have the example on the right of how you might set this up. So on the bottom in the green squares, you could have spaces for sticky notes. So either walking students through the number of steps within a given task and writing each one down as its own to-do item and sticking them at the bottom of the page, or all the tasks that have to get done within a given time period, right? So the brainstorming part of this to-do list is really identifying each task on a sticky note and placing it at the bottom of the page, and then talking the student through the prioritization process. So which activities have to happen first? You know, pick 3 things that have to happen first. Or do you want to start with something that's easy or challenging today? Let's pick those top 3 things. It'll help to have students really start to make sense of their own preferences and approaches to using time by really creating a concrete idea of what they need to be focusing on. And the nice thing about this is that once they've developed their priorities, the top 3 things, for example, they'll be working on, you can cover up the rest of the to-do list and leave the items there, but visually have the student focus on those 3 things that they've identified. So that can be a nice way of breaking down the steps in a process or the things that they're working on at a given time.
Moving on to the executive function skill of working memory. Working memory is the ability to hold information in memory while completing complex tasks. So we use working memory to complete daily tasks. For example, a young child following a 2-step direction to go get a book or a preferred toy and bring it back is using working memory. So is a young adult who is remembering that they have multiple homework assignments to complete in a given night. And we also use working memory to complete learning tasks. So for example, to compare and contrast 2 events or viewpoints, a student has to hold in working memory information about both events or viewpoints to make that comparison. So we provide 2 strategies here. The first is graphic organizers, and we all love graphic organizers. Here, what we want to reinforce is the use of the same or consistent graphic organizers. So using them repeatedly so that the students learn to use a certain process until it becomes routine. So for example, we're going to see a writing graphic organizer on an upcoming slide that has 5 sections: topic, sentence, conclusion, and 5 details, or 3 details in the middle. So it's really 5 boxes. So providing something like that repeatedly so that it becomes routine until the student is able to remove, you're able to remove some of that scaffolding and they're able to use it independently. And the second example is visual support. So any kind of visual helps working memory, especially students working with multi-step directions. And when you're working to build independence with children, visuals can help boost their working memory. So taking a look at a few examples, basic compare and contrast Venn diagram at the top. You can see how the information about summer and winter is here on the slide. That way the student doesn't have to expend a lot of energy on working memory, pulling that information. They just have it there so that they can complete the center of the diagram. And there's a basic visual here for the steps that are given when you tell your child, it's time to go. Instead of having to say, get your shoes on, get your coat on, get in the car, you could have this small visual posted. And we also share several links to resources related to developing graphic organizers and to accessing some pre-made graphic organizers on this slide for you as well.
So the executive skill of regulating emotions refers to regulating the intensity of emotions, even under unexpected or frustrating circumstances. So for example, a child who loses a game that they're playing with a friend can remain calm and move on to the next game or the next activity, or a teen who feels anxious about giving a speech copes with that anxiety to then complete the task. So we have a few things identified here, and we want to start with reiterating the importance of building a supportive environment. So it's important that students feel valued, safe, and have a sense of belonging, particularly when we're asking them to work on challenging things like learning to regulate their emotions. Having interpersonal connections with students creates a space for trust and working through feelings that might feel challenging. The same goes for physical space. So when the expectation is visible to students that there are resources and there's a supportive adult reminding them to use them in ways that honor the ways that their ways of being and how they navigate emotions, can be a really great model for students learning to self-regulate. And when we think about the environment, resources might be a designated space where a student can go get some quiet and calm support time, or if a student needs some movement to help regulate their emotions, a space in the room, or a practice expectation of a practice where a student can go take a walk or get some extra movement. Having that all set up in the physical environment can be really helpful. The expectation that a student might not always need to talk about their feelings or their emotions, but can draw their thoughts instead of having that conversation and have a trusted adult or a peer to do that with. Those are all some examples of how you build in a supportive environment. It's important to remember that we want to build spaces and relationships that work with students and that we're not trying to force students to be or feel in ways that don't come naturally to them, but that they're regulating their emotions in the ways that make sense for them and their brains and their bodies. Some ways to do that include mindfulness strategies. So mindfulness is the practice of paying attention intentionally to the present moment. And this can have a calming effect on the brain and the body. And by engaging in short mindfulness activities consistently, students can develop mindfulness-based practices related to regulating their emotions so that they have them to rely on when things feel chaotic or stressful. Which then impacts their brain's ability to be available for other executive functioning skills as well. So some examples we have of short mindfulness activities might be guided breathing, class meditations, mindful movement or walking. So helping students, feel their feet on the floor as they walk and take a movement break, notice the feelings in the air, things like that. Again, self-check-ins, we've talked about this quite a bit through this presentation. They can really help with metacognition or thinking about thinking, and related to regulating emotions by providing consistent prompts for students to think about how they're feeling or to acknowledge how they're feeling about, for example, an activity or a task or a place in school or at home. It can help to connect the executive skill of regulating emotions with self-monitoring and self-regulating as well. So some examples of those kinds of prompts might be, how am I feeling about getting started on this activity, or how did I feel about doing that task that I just finished? How am I working in this environment? What do I need? Students often have really creative solutions to things that they might need. And so encouraging them to reflect on that and share what might be supportive can be a really helpful way in learning to regulate their emotions. And finally, the last example is self-coaching. So teaching students to self-monitor or to regulate their emotions through challenging or new or unfamiliar tasks. So one way to do this, I'll flip to the next slide and explain, is by having available affirmations for students to choose from, and then prompting students and supporting them in selecting one before they give an activity as a way of getting centered before they start a task, reminding themselves that they have the ability to coach themselves and regulate themselves through an activity. So on the right-hand side, we have some examples of things like that students could say to themselves or write down on a sticky note before they get started. They could say, I'm ready, breathe, I know I can do this, one step at a time. And these could be available as little cards or on a worksheet for students to select before they get started on something. So that's just one example of a self-coaching approach to build into your classroom for all students. On the left-hand side, just a note that we do have some links to some great social emotional learning resources that also build in some great connections to regulating emotions as well. So please check those out at your convenience.
Moving on to the executive skill of task initiation. Task initiation is the ability to start a project or task when needed without excessive delay or without that feeling of just being stuck. For example, it could be, asking a child to clean their room or to start a homework assignment without one-on-one assistance. And we know that task initiation is especially difficult when we're unsure or not confident in how to begin a task, or when a task just feels overwhelming or non-preferred. We provide 2 strategies for working on task initiation. The first one is providing scaffolding for getting started. So we want to reiterate, this is about getting started. So sometimes we'll provide the accommodation of extended time. The accommodation of extended time really is not going to support a student who needs help with the executive skill of task initiation, right? Because it's not that they need more time, they just need help with how to go about initiating the task. And scaffolding, by providing help with the first step or the initial phase of a task, helps to build that student's sense of competency, because then once you help them get started, they can complete the task. And then what we do is, reduce that amount of scaffolding over time. And the second strategy example is chunking tasks or assignments. And by that, we mean breaking assignments down into smaller parts so that the overall task becomes more manageable. And it also provides an opportunity as a teacher or parent to have check-in times and times to provide feedback to the student after each of those assignment sections. So in the next slide, there's an example that I mentioned previously, a graphic organizer for writing. We find that in the area of writing, students need a lot of scaffolding for task initiation, even at the college level. And always helping students to get started with writing assignments is important. We hear from our writing center staff at the university level that they use strategies in the classroom. So for example, in our basic freshman writing course, one of our colleagues mentions that when she assigns a new task, she has students either on their laptop or on paper get a first sentence down before they leave her room. And we also are initiating a new course as of next fall at the college level, where students who identify as neurodivergent and who have some weakness in executive skills can take a course that is going to be more targeted to writing and executive skill work than we offered previously. So that's how important we feel about providing these supports and accommodations. So on the left side of this slide, you'll also see a few resources, one for teachers on scaffolding, and another that's more for parents about breaking down assignments at home.
So the executive skill of goal-directed persistence is staying focused on a goal at hand and not being distracted from completing that goal by external stimuli. So an example of this is if a student has a goal of getting 100% completion on their homework, they might set a routine to complete their homework at a particular time, either immediately after school or after they've taken a break after school each day. Or another example is a teenager who has a goal to get their driver's license, persists at practicing driving for a particular amount of time until they're ready for their driver's test. So those are examples of goals that might require goal-directed persistence. And before I get into the examples, just a note that as you get started thinking about this, it's really helpful to start by helping students set small, achievable goals so that they experience success. So for example, if we're thinking still about writing, if a student is working on, if the task is, work on a draft, maybe focusing on, I'm going to write a paragraph before the end of this period, before I get a break. And so that students can really see and feel successful with small steps of reaching their goals. And then that can extend into longer drawn out processes for goal-directed persistence. It can also be helpful to model setting goals for students. So for example, you can narrate to your students, I'm setting the goal of noticing and acknowledging when students are working well together collaboratively during this class. So when you hear me or see me making a positive comment about students working together during class today, give me a thumbs up, right? So it helps students to really notice that you are setting goals, how you're setting them, and acknowledge when you're demonstrating meeting those goals. Some other examples are thinking about multi-step processes, like we've just talked about. It's so important to break things down into chunks, and it's also important to provide models of each step in a process. So it helps for students and children and adults to get a visual of what the expectations are of each step in a process, and gives them a sense of how to start and how to know when to stop when they've met that particular goal. More broadly, just having exemplars, particularly that have been created by other students, of what the end goal is at the beginning of a process. So for example, if the end goal is a research paper, giving students access to an example of that can create a concrete representation of what students are working towards, and a place to start. So that can also support task initiation as well as goal-directed persistence. And finally, getting student feedback. So asking students to reflect on what they think they need to meet a goal. Would a visual reminder be helpful? Do they want to check in with a peer? Do they have an idea for an alternate strategy? As we've mentioned, students often have really creative ideas about what would be supportive to them. So helping them see the value of those supports, having some control over the supports that they receive, and seeing that as critical to reaching their goals can be very powerful. On the next slide, we have an example of a goal setting process. So this is a really nice 3-step process that you can do in writing or during as a conversation. And I'll look for specifically at the top in blue. So the student has identified their goal as turning their homework in on time. So that's really step 1. What's the goal you want to meet? The second step is in advance identifying obstacles or things that might get in their way. So this student says they might forget which homework assignments are due and when, or they might forget to turn in their finished homework. They might not have all the materials they need to finish their homework. So those are all examples of barriers that students can think through in advance that might impact them meeting their goal. And then finally, the third step is identifying tools or what supports students can access if they get stuck or need help. So this student has identified that they might use a planner, they might create a designated homework spot, and they might use a self-monitoring checklist. What's really important about this step in the goal setting process is that not only do students identify what the tools are that they might access, but also how and what that means, right? So there's a description under each strategy. So for example, designated homework spot, that means I'm going to choose a specific place and time where I do my homework every single day. It's really important because some of these strategies can become very vague and amorphous, but if we create a concrete representation of what exactly it means to use that strategy, students will have this to reference when they feel stuck or when they feel like they might need some additional support. So that's an example of how you might walk students through and scaffold the process of goal setting in advance so that they have access to all the steps that they might need in achieving that goal.
So that concludes our content, and we'd like to thank you all for taking part in our Inclusion Institute. On this slide, we do provide links to references and resources that you can take a look at your own time or on your own time. And with our remaining time, what we'd like to do is consider that we all benefit from making a personal connection to the content. So we'd like to start by making a personal connection to our own executive functions, our own skills. And we'd like to do that with the prompt on this slide. So we ask that you consider the following executive functions and identify one goal area that you would like to improve upon. Is it your organization, being on time, managing emotions, getting started on tasks, completing tasks you've already started, or perhaps another executive skill? And then think about what's one strategy you could begin implementing. It could be one we shared or something else that you've come up with. And we ask that you share either your goal or your strategy in the chat. We'll do the same. And also consider, what could be the impact of sharing your goal and your strategy more explicitly with your children, your students, and or a family member. Thank you.